The February air felt heavier than usual when I stepped out of the lawyer's office. Boston's sky was the color of wet concrete, holding back rain it didn't seem ready to release. Somewhere far off, I could hear the hum of traffic, but here in the small parking lot everything felt muffled, as if the whole world had turned down its volume. Daniel was still inside, signing the last of the papers. He wouldn't cry, not here, not in front of people. My son had learned early how to keep his emotions locked behind closed doors, something he might have inherited from me, or maybe from Claire. The reading of Claire's will had been brief. The house came to me, a modest sum to cover expenses, and then nothing addressed to Daniel directly. The lawyer closed his folder, ready to end the meeting, but then looked at me. "Could I have a word with you?" "Alone." Daniel didn't seem to care, just nodded and stepped out. That's when the lawyer handed me a thick brown envelope, my name written in neat cursive across the front. "Claire asked me to give this to you personally," he said. His voice was measured, almost cautious, like he didn't want to carry the weight of whatever was inside. The paper felt cold against my fingers. The corners were a little worn, as though it had been handled many times before finally making its way to me. I didn't open it. Not there. Not with Daniel, just a room away. Back in the car, I sat with it in my lap, running my thumb along the seam. I tried to summon the last look Claire had given me before she passed, but all I could remember was her turning her face toward the hospital window, refusing to meet my eyes. The passenger door opened, and Daniel slid in without a word. He turned on the heater, eyes on his phone. The silence between us was thick enough to touch, like a third person sitting in the back seat. I didn't know what the envelope held, but I knew one thing. Whatever it was, it had the power to change something between us, and I wasn't ready for that. That night, I waited until Daniel had gone home before I opened the envelope. The house was quiet, too quiet. Even the old radiator seemed to hold its breath. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, my hands resting on the envelope as if it might bite. For a while, I just stared at it. The paper looked darker under the yellow kitchen light, its edges frayed, the flap slightly bent. Finally, I slid a finger under the seal. The sound of tearing paper felt too loud in the stillness. Inside, there was a single folded sheet and a bank statement. I read the letter first. "Michael, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I want you to decide what to do with what I've left in the account attached. This isn't in the will. It's separate, in my name only. I trust you to know when or if Daniel should know about it." There was no signature, no closing line, no "Love, Claire." Just the letter and the statement. The account balance made my chest tighten, $248,300. I had no idea she had this kind of money. We'd never had that much in savings together, not once in 35 years of marriage. I leaned back, rubbing my face with both hands. Why had she kept this from me? From us? And why leave it in my hands, of all people? I thought about Daniel. He was 34, working long hours at a job he hated, drowning in student loans and credit card debt. I knew the money would help him. But I also knew what it might stir up. Old accusations, bitterness toward his mother, questions I couldn't answer. My eyes drifted to the window. Outside, the streetlight flickered against the bare branches of the maple tree we'd planted when Daniel was born. I remembered Claire standing there with a baby in her arms, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. I folded the papers and walked to the bedroom. Inside my closet, there's a small safe, a wedding gift from my father. I put the envelope inside, turned the key and hung it back on my keyring. And then I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the closed closet door, feeling like I'd just buried something twice. I didn't sleep much that night. The ceiling in my bedroom had always been just another ceiling, but now it felt like a canvas where old memories projected themselves. Some were faint, like photographs left too long in the sun. Others were sharp enough to hurt. Daniel was 16, the night things finally cracked between him and Claire. We were in the kitchen. He'd just come home late, smelling faintly of beer. Claire stood by the sink, washing the dinner dishes, her back to him. She asked where he'd been, and his answer was a shrug. "Don't you care at all?" she said without turning around. "I care enough to not waste my time here," he shot back. Her hands stilled in the soapy water. I remember the clink of a plate slipping against the metal sink. "You were never there for me, Mum, not when I needed you," he said. His voice didn't crack, but something in it broke. Claire didn't respond. She just kept washing, slower now. The only sound in the room was water running over porcelain. I stood in the doorway, useless. I didn't step in. I didn't defend her. I didn't defend him. I just stood there, wishing someone would say the right thing, and knowing neither of them would. That night was the first time I realized they weren't just having teenage arguments. There was a deeper fracture between them, something I couldn't name, and I never did. Now, years later, sitting at the same kitchen table, I thought about how that fracture had never healed. Maybe the money could fix something, or maybe it would tear open wounds so deep they'd never close. I reached for my coffee mug, forgetting it was still cold from hours earlier. The bitter taste clung to my tongue. I poured it down the sink, and for a moment, I saw Claire standing there again, her shoulders hunched, silent in the dim light. The safe in the closet felt heavier than it had any right to. Claire's last weeks were a blur of hospital corridors, soft beeping machines, and the constant smell of antiseptic. The winter light that filtered through her room's narrow window was pale, the kind that makes even the living look ghostly. Daniel came once. It was a Thursday afternoon. He stood near the door, hands buried in the pockets of his jacket, as though crossing the threshold would mean something he wasn't ready to face. "Hi, Mum," he said. Claire looked at him for maybe a second, then glanced away, focusing on the TV mounted in the corner, where a muted cooking show played. I tried to fill the space between them. "Daniel's been working long hours," I said, but my voice sounded too bright, too false. Neither of them responded. He stayed 15 minutes. When he left, he kissed her forehead. She didn't flinch, but she didn't lean into it either. The door closed behind him, and I swear I heard her exhale in a way I'd never heard before. Not relief, not pain, something in between. That night, as I sat beside her bed, she asked, "Do you think he hates me?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. I think she took my silence as an answer. Now, sitting in my kitchen months later, I thought about that question, and about the account. Maybe she'd left the money as some kind of peace offering, or maybe it was her way of saying she still wanted a connection with him, one she couldn't give in life. But how do you give someone a gift from a person they can barely think about without wincing? The safe in my closet seemed louder in my mind than the ticking wall clock. The key weighed against my leg in my pocket. I wasn't sure which was heavier, the money or the choice of when to reveal it. I told myself I'd think about it for a week. A week turned into 2, then a month. Every time I considered telling Daniel, I pictured his face, not the adult version, but the boy I used to know, the one who had learned early not to expect much from his mother's affection. I imagined the look he might give me if I told him she'd left a fortune hidden away, something she never mentioned in her will. Would it confirm every resentment he'd ever carried? Would it feel like proof she had chosen to keep a part of herself and her life entirely separate from him? On a rainy Sunday morning, I made my choice. I unlocked the closet, knelt in front of the safe and turned the key. Inside, the envelope was exactly where I'd left it. I placed it inside a plain manila folder, slid it to the back, and locked the door again. Then I took the key off my keyring and put it in the small wooden box on my dresser, the one that held my father's cufflinks and my wedding ring. It wasn't about hiding the key. It was about creating one more step between the temptation and the act. That afternoon, Daniel came by to drop off a book I'd lent him. We stood in the entryway, the smell of wet pavement still clinging to his jacket. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said too quickly. He nodded once, and we both knew that was the end of it. No talk about Claire, no mention of the will. After he left, I stood at the window, watching him pull away. My reflection stared back at me in the glass. A man holding on to a secret he couldn't decide was mercy or betrayal. Months passed, each one like a stone dropped into still water. Barely a ripple on the surface of my life, but I could feel the weight sinking deeper. Daniel and I saw each other occasionally. A Sunday dinner here, a quick lunch there. We kept it safe, weather, work, the Red Sox, never Claire, never the past. One evening, we sat in a booth at a diner off Route 1. The smell of burnt coffee and fried food clung to the air. Daniel stirred his iced tea with a straw, eyes fixed on the table. "You know," he said, "Mom never really left me anything. Not money. Not much else." The words were casual, but I could hear the fracture underneath. I sipped my coffee, the bitterness stinging my tongue, and searched for something to say that wouldn't open a door I wasn't ready to walk through. "Your mother had her way of showing care," I said finally. He gave a short laugh. "If you say so." We didn't speak of it again. But that night, lying in bed, his words looped in my mind. Each time they seemed heavier, as though they were trying to pull the key out of that wooden box in my dresser. By early spring, I began to dream about Claire. She would be sitting in the old wicker chair in our backyard, wearing that faded blue dress she loved. The light would be warm, the kind of gold you only get just before sunset. She never spoke, just watched me. And each time I woke, the safe felt closer, like it had moved an inch toward me during the night. The dreams didn't stop. Some nights Claire sat in the backyard as always, silent, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Other nights, she stood by the kitchen window, the glass fogged between us. I would try to speak, but my voice wouldn't come. She would tilt her head slightly, like she was waiting for me to confess something. I started waking up earlier than usual, restless, the taste of those unsaid words still in my mouth. It was around this time that Daniel's life began to fray at the edges. He called one night, his voice low and flat. "Dad, I might need to borrow some money." "How much?" I asked, though my stomach had already knotted. "Not much, just enough to cover rent until I get a check from work. Things are tight." I sent him a modest sum the next day, enough to help, but not enough to raise questions. It was the same strategy I'd used for years. Give just enough so he wouldn't drown, but not enough to change the current he was swimming in. A week later, I stopped by his apartment to drop off a toolbox he'd asked for. The place looked tired. Peeling paint, boxes stacked in the corner, the smell of stale coffee and something faintly sour in the air. He joked about it, but his eyes gave him away. Driving home, I kept thinking about the account, about how that money could clear his debts, give him a clean start. But I also knew what it would do to him emotionally, the questions it would open, the anger it might unearth. That night, the dream changed. Claire was closer, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. No words, just her gaze holding mine. And for the first time, I felt like I was the one who couldn't look away. By summer, the cracks in Daniel's life had widened. He stopped mentioning work in our conversations. When I asked how things were going, he'd shrug and change the subject. I didn't press, partly out of habit, partly because I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Then came the call. It was a Wednesday night, just past 9. "Dad, I'm in a bit of a mess," he said. His voice was steady but quieter than usual. "My car needs a new transmission. I can't cover it, not with rent and everything else. If I don't get it fixed, I can't get to work. And if I can't get to work..." The unspoken end of that sentence hung there, sharp and obvious. "I can help," I said, but the words felt like they were being pulled out of me. Not all of it, but some. There was a pause. I appreciate it. We hung up without much else said. I wired him enough to keep the situation from collapsing, but it was a bandage on a wound that wasn't going to heal on its own. That night, the safe called to me again. I opened the closet, crouched in front of it, and ran my hand over the cool metal door. The key was still in the wooden box on my dresser, resting under my father's cufflinks. For a moment, I imagined unlocking it, pulling out the envelope and handing it to Daniel. I could picture the way his eyes would widen at the number, the flood of questions, the quiet that would follow. But then I imagined something else, him asking why she'd never told him, why she'd trusted me instead, why she'd kept it secret until after she died. I imagined him hearing every unspoken answer as an accusation. I closed the closet door without opening the safe. The next morning, the dream returned. Claire was in the kitchen again, but this time she stood at the sink, her back to me, washing dishes in slow, deliberate circles, just like that night, all those years ago. It happened on a Saturday morning at the farmer's market. I was halfway through buying apples when I heard my name. Michael. I turned and saw Margaret, Claire's oldest friend. She looked almost exactly the same as the last time I'd seen her at the funeral, tall, neatly dressed, with that steady gaze that always seemed to know more than she let on. We exchanged polite smiles, the kind people wear when the past still feels too close. "I've been meaning to reach out," she said, holding a small basket of blueberries. "I didn't want to intrude." "You wouldn't have," I said. "It's been a strange few months." She nodded. "I know Claire would have wanted you and Daniel to find some peace after everything." We stood in silence for a moment, then she glanced away, as if debating something. "You know, just a few weeks before she passed, Claire told me she'd left something for Daniel. Not in the will, but something separate. She said he'd only get it when he was ready to understand." The words hit me like cold water. "What do you mean by ready to understand?" I asked, but my voice came out tighter than I intended. Margaret shrugged gently. "I didn't ask, I figured it was between the two of you, but she seemed sure about it." A vendor called out behind me, breaking the moment. Margaret smiled faintly, touched my arm, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there for a long time, the sounds of the market, chatter, clinking coins, the thud of crates being stacked, fading into a dull hum. If Margaret was right, Claire had intended for Daniel to have that money. Which meant I wasn't just holding on to a secret. I might be standing in the way of her last wish. Margaret's words followed me home like an echo I couldn't shake. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, the only glow coming from the street lamp outside. The shadows pooled in the corners of the room, making it feel smaller, closer. If Claire had wanted Daniel to have the money, then what was I doing? Was I honoring her trust by waiting until the right time? Or was I just afraid? Afraid of the anger he might turn on me? Afraid of being the messenger for a gift that might feel more like an insult? I thought about all the times I'd chosen silence over honesty, not just with Daniel, with Claire too. There were years in our marriage when we lived in the same house, but barely shared our inner lives. I had told myself it was to keep the peace. Now I wondered if it was just to keep myself comfortable. The safe upstairs seemed louder in my mind than the hum of the refrigerator. I imagined opening it, taking out the envelope, calling Daniel right then. I even stood up, took a step toward the stairs, but I stopped, because the truth was I wasn't sure if I wanted to give him the money for him, or for me. To relieve the pressure in my own chest, to stop the dreams, to quiet Claire's silent stare in my head. I leaned against the counter, the cool surface grounding me. Tomorrow would mark a year since she died. I knew I'd see Daniel, and I knew, deep down, that the weight of the envelope would be there with me no matter how far I tried to bury it. The morning of the anniversary was cold, even for February. Frost clung to the grass in the cemetery, crunching under my shoes as I made my way to Claire's headstone. I'd brought a small bouquet of white lilies. She'd always liked them, though she never said so outright. I wasn't expecting to see anyone else there, but as I turned the corner between rows of markers, I saw him. Daniel stood a few feet from her grave, holding a bouquet of his own. Simple daisies, their stems wrapped in a rubber band. He looked up when he heard me. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I answered. We didn't hug. We didn't need to. We just walked the last few steps together and stood there in silence. The winter air was sharp, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the low rumble of traffic. I placed my lilies down beside his daisies. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, staring at the stone as if it might speak back to him. "She never liked long goodbyes," he said quietly. "No," I agreed. "She didn't." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was steady, like a bridge that didn't quite connect both sides, but was holding anyway. After a few minutes, we turned and walked back toward the parking lot. No promises to call more often, no sudden heart-to-hearts. Just two men carrying flowers and a shared history neither of us could fully put into words. But as I drove home, I realized something had shifted. Not much, but enough to feel it. The question wasn't whether Daniel was ready for the truth. It was whether I was ready to give it. That night, I sat in the living room with the envelope on my lap. The safe was open upstairs, the key still resting in the lock. I'd brought it down without fully deciding why. The paper felt heavier than it should, as if the weight inside wasn't the money but everything it represented. 35 years of marriage, the silence between mother and son, and my own unwillingness to be the one to bridge it. I picked up the phone and dialed Daniel's number. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, then paused. "I was wondering if you wanted to come by for dinner Sunday. I'll make the roast you like." "Sure," he said. "Sounds good." I almost said it then. "Daniel, your mother left you something. Something big." But the words got stuck somewhere between my chest and my mouth. We talked a few more minutes about the weather, about the game, and then hung up. After the call, I sat there for a long time, the envelope still in my hands. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, each second feeling like an accusation. Finally, I stood, walked back upstairs, and locked the envelope away again. Not because I didn't want to tell him, but because I knew Sunday might be the last chance to get it right, and I couldn't afford to get it wrong. Sunday came with the smell of rosemary and garlic filling the kitchen. I set the table the way Claire used to, forks on the left, knives on the right, folded cloth napkins instead of paper. Daniel arrived just after 6, carrying a bottle of wine. "I didn't know what pairs with roast," he said with a half smile. "Neither do I answered, and we both laughed lightly, the kind of laugh that only works when neither person is trying too hard. Dinner started the way most of ours did. Work talk, a bit of sports, small updates on distant relatives. But midway through the meal, Daniel put down his fork and looked at his plate for a long moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about her," he said. His voice was low, almost cautious. "About Mom." I stayed quiet, letting him find the words. I spent a lot of years being angry at her, and I told myself it was her fault we didn't have a real relationship. But I don't know. Lately, I've been wondering if I made it harder than it had to be. Maybe I didn't want to fix it because I was afraid it wouldn't work. He picked up his glass but didn't drink from it. I guess I thought I'd have more time to figure it out. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten. My hand itched to reach for the safe key upstairs. This was the moment Claire might have been waiting for, the moment when the gift wouldn't just be money, but a bridge. But I also knew a bridge can be walked in both directions. It could bring him closer, or it could lead him straight back into the anger he'd just begun to leave behind. "I think she'd be glad you're thinking about her now," I said softly. Daniel nodded, then changed the subject, almost as if he'd startled himself by saying so much. The rest of the meal passed without another mention of Claire, but in my mind, her voice, the one I hadn't heard in years, was loud. "He's almost ready, Michael." That night after Daniel left, I stood in the quiet kitchen with the dishes still on the table. The roast was cold, the wine half finished. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock above the doorway. Upstairs, I opened the safe. The envelope was right where it had been for the past year, edges worn from the number of times I'd held it without following through. I carried it to my desk and sat for a long while, staring at it. Then I reached for a sheet of paper and began to write. "Daniel, your mother left this for you. She didn't put it in the will because she wanted it given when you were ready. I've kept it until now because I wasn't sure when that would be. But after tonight, I think you're closer than you've ever been. This isn't just money, it's her way of saying she cared, even if she didn't always know how to show it. Whatever you do with it, I hope it brings you some peace." I signed my name, folded the letter, and slipped it into the envelope with the bank statement. Then I placed everything in a small wooden box Claire had once used to keep old family photos. The next day, while Daniel was at work, I drove to his apartment. I let myself in with the spare key he'd given me years ago and set the box on his bed. No note to tell him to open it. No phone call to explain. I locked the door behind me and walked down the stairs without looking back. It was his now. All of it. 3 days passed without a word. I told myself he hadn't found it yet, or maybe he had, and the silence was his way of processing. Either way, I didn't call. I didn't want to push. On the 4th evening, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. "Dad, thank you for everything." No mention of the money, no questions, no accusations, just those words. 2 nights later, he stopped by unannounced. We were standing in the hallway when he stepped forward and hugged me. It wasn't a quick, polite embrace. It lingered, and for a moment I felt the boy he used to be, the one who still trusted me to keep him safe. When he pulled back, he didn't say anything else. He just smiled faintly and left. I stood there for a while, the door still open, the cold air slipping into the house. Somewhere deep inside, I felt something loosen. Claire's gift had been money, but what she'd really left was space, a space for us to meet again without the weight of everything unspoken. I closed the door, the quiet settling around me like a blanket. If this story made you think about your own family, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have given the money right away or kept it until the right moment? I read every single comment, and your stories matter here. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and when the next video pops up on your screen, click it. Because the journey we started here is far from over.